Hey folks, how are you doing? So today we will be going over and covering the Great Depression and the New Deal. We're going to be covering some of the big markers and sort of the lead-ups to the Great Depression. Some of it we covered during the last lecture, the very tail end in terms of farming, right? And the farming industry and the communities that started to see, their revenues drop. They started to see some of the farms shut down and close. And it was sort of a precursor, right, to the larger effects that the the Great Depression in the United States was going to, undergo, right, in the next number of years. And then we will discuss just how deep and prevalent the Depression was, and heralding FDR into office, right, one of the greatest U.S. presidents ever to sit within the office. Definitely probably within the top, few tiers, right? And then his famous New Deal. There are actually two, first New Deal and the second, but we'll kind of just globally call that the New Deal. And so have a general discussion of all of this. So all of this is going to be a precursor into our next section, which will be World War II. And so hopefully you like the lecture and find it entertaining. So first off, the Great Depression. Most of you have probably seen some type of film or cartoon or something or other dealing with the great stock crash, in New York, right, called Black Tuesday in 1929. So this is a very interesting date because in our previous lectures, dealing with the 1920s, the Jazz Age, right, our videos of watching Leonardo DiCaprio be amazing, as the Great Gatsby. The 20s were this amazing time period, right? Nicknamed the Roaring 20s because money was plentiful. Businesses were booming. People had a ton of excess income to spend on leisurely activities, going to the movies, shopping, doing all that kind of jazz. So the fact that at the very end of the 20s, we had this catastrophic, plunge. It was a bit ironic, right? That the 20s, the Roaring 20s, are now going to turn into the depressing 30s. And so on this particular date, the New York Stock Exchange completely and utterly collapsed. And so it was setting off a bunch of dominoes, right? Probably the first few dominoes, as we spoke about last time, was the precursor of the farming industries. Many of them were shutting down. We had tens of thousands of small farms pack up and go to the West Coast, to California, because they just could not make their payments any longer. And so the farming industries were the first ones truly hit, but it hadn't, let's say, reached the stardom level, right, quote unquote, of getting up to the Wall Street, trading. That's kind of a very high tier, very in-your-face issue that something is wrong, right? Obviously, Wall Street and investors now represent all of America, but because many of the banks during this day and age were intertwined with all of these investments, the fact that the stock market was plunging also meant that the banks were going down. And if the banks were going down, that meant that people and all of their savings are also going to start going down as well. And so over a few days, the stock market saw around $10 billion lost. And so people started to panic, right? People started to get nervous about, how is life going to continue on? Are they going to be able to still, check out their savings and their money within the banks, right? And how everything's going to work. And so we'll kind of detail some of that moving forward. But this is going to mark the beginning of what is called the Great Depression in the United States. Arguably, we've had a few great recessions since, in the 70s, the early 2000s, the 2008-2009 recession, the 2019-2020 global pandemic recession. And so, we've had quite a few since, but the Great Depression still kind of holds its own as this kind of cataclysmic event. If any of the recent recessions can hold a candle to it, I would probably say that the 2020 global pandemic comes pretty darn close. If not, has the potential to be even worse. But the Great Depression began in the 1929, approximately during the stock crash, and lasted all the way up until World War II. So if you could imagine, this was an entire decade, or just a little bit over a decade, of economic sinking, right, in the U.S. And most people were not making a good life for themselves. They were really struggling. During a good portion of the Great Depression, we saw Herbert Hoover was the president of the United States. And he probably was not the right choice to be president, right, and commander-in-chief, and sort of the symbolic, executive branch that the Americans needed at the time. Because he was very famous for being a staunch conservative. He was famous for publishing his work American Individualism earlier in his life, but his thoughts pretty much remain the same, which is he did not like government regulation. He thought that the economy and that Americans should go on with their usual life, and that government should have a much smaller role. And so that is not probably the best solution for a president, especially when the economy is kind of in a free fall and needs some type of governmental control, right, to come in and regulate things and just calm down everyone's fears and anxieties. And so he pretty much just was looking at the fire, and the fire is getting larger, and he just keeps saying, it's fine, just don't touch it. And so he kept promising that poverty would soon be banished from this earth, but he did not really live up to that claim. If you have some extra time, watch these two videos. The one on the left-hand side is more of a kind of History Channel-esque interviews with some professors, discussion of the Wall Street market crash and why it was relevant. And on the right-hand side, we have our resident chief historian John Green, discussing the Great Depression in length, and he does a really good job of kind of summarizing all of the points and a lot of the kind of events in between for us. And so imagine you were waking up one day and you pick up the local newspaper where you get all of your news, right? The social media moguls of their day and age. And so it says Wall Street in panic as stocks crash, attempts to kill Italy's crown prince. That is on the second tier of news, right? So something that would probably make headline news is on the second one. So Wall Street is definitely in everyone's minds, and it is, going to have considerable ramifications. And so immediately after, right, after a couple months, the layoffs start, right? Businesses start to lay off because, the fear, right, is really gripping everyone. And then collectively, businesses and manufacturing and banks, everyone is going downhill and closing up shop. And so you see, this will be a regular sight. Grown men, right? The one on the left saying, wanted, a decent job, buy a decent man, age 37, family, war veteran, paying on home, college-trained, native, Chicagoan, purchasing, accounting, etc., right? Has so much experience, and yet in the heyday of his life, finds himself unemployed. On the right-hand side, wanted, a decent job, family man, age 44, best reference, clerical or manual experience, right? 3 years at the Ford company. These guys are definitely trying to, put food on the table. And it's getting more and more difficult. So as we're having these conversations and making parallels to it in the modern day and age, I think we can definitely, make some comparisons into what is currently happening with, let's say, the job market, and people finding themselves a bit out of luck when it comes to income. And then soon after, we start to see the food lines, right? Soup kitchens, the bread lines, as they used to call it. And so if people don't have jobs, they don't have enough money for food, they need, assistance, right? And so local businesses and, people who are still kind of, having some type of supplies, they're able to kind of come in and provide some services for the folks, and so I can't imagine how much pride all of these workers had to swallow, right, in order to be in the lines and to get food for themselves. Even my own grandparents, they grew up in the Soviet Union during the 40s, And so that was right after World War II had ended. And, they remember very clearly in like Stalin's generation, right, and years that, there were still bread lines in certain parts of Russia. And so this kind of, speaks to all peoples, all cultures, not necessarily just an American economic collapse, but definitely, a human nature, right? Everyone who finds themselves out of work needs to do whatever they can to feed themselves and their families, right? So tragedy knows no color, and tragedy knows no socioeconomic status. It kind of goes after everyone. Here's some wonderful stories from the Great Depression that we have. So if you click the link here, you'll see this wonderful video of some first-hand account stories of the Great Depression, what they had to go through, and what some of the kind of daily, weekly, monthly challenges would have been for people that have like pretty much lost everything. And so it's very heart-wrenching in a certain few moments, but definitely one that's very educational to watch if you have the stomach for it. So as we're 2 years into the Great Depression and 1931 rears its head, right? The 30s are just starting. Many Americans were feeling that Hoover was not appropriately responding to all of this tragedy. And his Secretary of the Treasury, right, similar to how we have like the Federal Reserve now, right, or kind of like a large institution of finance, kept assuring him that economic downturns are a normal part of capitalism and that sooner or later it is going to regulate itself and kind of come back on the up and up. Now, the problem with this is, I'll first start off and say that he is correct and then say what the problem with that is. So he was correct in the sense that, yes, in capitalism and in the U.S. economy, the economy always goes up and down, right? We have our good years and we have let's say a small recession and then good years and a small recession, etc. However, they were mistaken thinking that this was another one of those small recessions. That is just normal in the curve. However, it turned out to be a Great Depression, right? And the recession was not ending, it was just getting worse and worse. And so their philosophy, right, that conservative philosophy of being very hands-off, within the government, and taxes and loans and, interest rates and all of that, it works when it's a small recession because the economy can heal itself. However, when it's a larger depression, it really needs government intervention to get them back on their feet. I'll make the analogy of if you like randomly stub your toe, right, or get a paper cut or something, right, or even let's say worse than that, you have a flu. If you want to put that all under the umbrella of a recession, right, or a small recession, you can get better by yourself, right? If I leave you alone for a couple of days or a few days, you can kind of fight off the flu, drink some honey with tea and all of that stuff. And you'll kind of be fine. However, if, I don't know, God forbid, you're in a much more tragic state where you need to go to the emergency room, I can't just tell you and pat you on the back and say, oh, that's great, you'll just walk it off, right, within 2-3 days. No, you can't. So you need extra additional support. And in 31, Hoover kept stating his mantra, saying the government should not support the people. Federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character. So a very kind of conservative mindset of you have to pull yourself up from the bootstraps and make it happen yourself. And so once again, it has some merit. It really does during certain periods of time. But when true tragedy like this falls, and it is an issue too big for any person, city, county, or state to fix, the national government needs to step in. And we're going to kind of see in detail the difference between Hoover's response and the difference between FDR's response and, what the difference was. And so very soon after, as the 30s are progressing, we start to get this wonderful nickname called Hoovervilles. These were shanty towns built during the Depression by homeless in the U.S., and they were rampant. Very similar to how, we kind of go through Los Angeles, right? And then every single year it seems as though the homeless population is getting more and more, let's say, out of control. There's tents everywhere on the sides of the roads, on the sides of the freeways, and it's just become this kind of juggernaut of an issue, right? That's nobody kind of seems to be able to handle or get a grasp on. So imagine that times 10, right? Hoovervilles and shanty towns everywhere as far as the eye can see, such as this. So everyone is making makeshift homes for themselves in whatever forms that they could. We have images like this, right? Which is very stark as a contrast, because in the distance you have these wonderful, big, glorious buildings that in the 20s were constructed for eras of business and business moguls, right? And for capitalism, and for the roaring 20s. And then now right next door you have our shanty towns, right? Our Hoovervilles. It reminds me very reminiscently of Los Angeles, because we, in a very short distance, our city can go from multi-million-dollar homes to, small raggedy areas. If you go into, let's say, Hollywood Hills, you can find multi-million-dollar mansions by actors. But you go a few miles down the street, and then you start getting poorer socioeconomic communities. And so it's, a lot of this stuff is really kind of reminiscent of the modern day and age. If you have some time, watch this Welcome to Hooverville video. Kind of details some of these experiences in Hoovervilles, how they got started and created, how the local culture was within these Hoovervilles, and what Hoover's response was to all of this. And so that's pretty much the Great Depression, the early Great Depression in a nutshell. And the rest of it is going to spill into the New Deal. And that's why the chapter on the Great Depression is a little shorter lecture-wise, because most of it is through the 30s and into the 40s, right? It's not a singular 2-3 year event that I can just discuss, right? It's just stretching on and on. And so the New Deal over the years is going to try to tackle the issue of the Great Depression. So they're kind of intertwined. They're one and the same thing. And so now we are entering the New Deal territory, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, the famous president, right, that is going to enact these deals. We're going to see how exactly he came into political office and what his view and take was on all of this. So if some of you want to have a nice recap of the Great Depression, and there's a video here by, once again, our resident historian, John Green, kind of detailing the New Deal and some of the aspects of it and what are the things they were trying to fix, it'll definitely be a nice refresher. But let's just go over a general recap. During the Great Depression era, real output and prices fell dramatically. Our industrial production fell by 47%. Our entire GDP fell by 30%. Unemployment exceeded 20%. The numbers were not looking good. And it was probably even worse than this. People were struggling. Businesses and banks were closing. President Hoover had accomplished very, very little to remedy the situation because of his very hands-off approach. Hooverville communities were formed by all these struggling folks as well. And so life was not too good. And people were looking for somebody to kind of enter the public sphere, right? Take the mantle and say that I will be the champion of the people. I understand that things are, pretty bad right now. And so it really kind of is this generation is going to be a testament mainly to the executive branch, and shows just how much power the executive branch is going to have for, the better, right? For the greater good. And so we have FDR, the man, the myth, the legend. He was the fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, right? So apparently the family breeds presidentials, right? And he was one of the most successful presidents in U.S. history. Theodore Roosevelt obviously was very famous and successful in his own right, but I feel that FDR was even more successful than that, because as far as Theodore Roosevelt goes, yes, he was successful. He expanded United States sort of expansionism, right, and territory acquisition, and made the U.S. on an international stage even stronger and more respected. But FDR had the unfortunate pleasure of entering office when the nation was at its worst. And so it really is a testament to somebody's leadership skills when they are put in these situations, and everything is stacked against them, right? That is the most difficult time to be a president. And so how did he start off, his political career? He was first serving as an undersecretary of the Navy during World War I, so he's a veteran. Later ran for vice president in the 1920 ticket, but in 21 he contracted polio. He did survive, but he lost the use of his legs. And so famously, he would be disabled from the waist down. Now, this was a very interesting note to make, because during this time, TV and radio and photographs and all these kind of different medias were really coming into the forefront, right? So people wanted pictures of the president. People wanted to hear what they were saying, right? And have videos or whatever. And so we're going to see how that entered into his consciousness, and how he was very conscientious not to show folks that side of him, right? And we'll talk about the reasons why. And so as he was entering into political office for the presidency, he was aiming for what he called the New Deal. It ended up being the first New Deal, but the New Deal nonetheless. And so his first aim in this part one of the New Deal was economic recovery. Obviously, the economy was in a free fall, and so his main issue is economic stability. And so he wanted to introduce a number of bills, and he introduced a unprecedented number of new bills, all geared towards stabilizing the economy, providing relief for each individual, creating jobs, and helping businesses. It also helped him that Congress at the time was also Democratic. And so they kind of helped him pass as much as they could, right? They were working as a cohesive unit. And so he was advocating for a balanced budget. He was criticizing the president on lazy policies and behaviors, and advocated also for a repeal on prohibition, right? Because once again, we're still in the dry years here. And so obviously most folks are even more disgruntled, because imagine if you got laid off and you and your family are now facing poverty. Boy, having a stiff drink at that moment is definitely needed, but if it's prohibition, it's a bit dry. And so I think he wanted to alleviate some of these folks' hardships and burdens. And so he would eventually be famous for also his fireside chats. These were series of radio addresses given by the U.S. President himself for around 11 years or so, up until his death. And his fireside chats were, these wonderful, beautiful things where, for the first time in a U.S. president, term, he had these very intimate chats with the entire nation. He went on the radio in particular times per week and was talking to the people as if he were in their living rooms, right? Telling them, my fellow Americans, I understand things are difficult right now, but we're getting through it. We're here with us, right? He was trying to be that symbol, right, of leadership, and to give everyone a boost of morality. Here are two wonderful videos. The one on the left-hand side is rare footage of FDR walking with leg braces, and on the right-hand side is FDR's famous fireside chats. And so on the left-hand side, on the issue of him walking, back in this day and age, right, in a very kind of machismo, I guess, aspect, folks did not want to know, especially if you're in a public scenario like this, right, in the public eye. Any small critique against you could be made. And so FDR was very conscientious of this fact, and he did not want folks, especially in the larger American spectrum, to know that he could not walk, because he wanted to give off that impression that the U.S. president is strong. America will heal and be strong. And so he did everything he could and all of these various tricks to make sure that he looked like he was always standing up and he was, kind of exuding this additional strength. So over here, he already can't walk as he's standing on the podium. And so he has a combination of leg braces and is holding onto the podium for dear life. And so he is, half president, half actor, I would say. But it is also a testament to the news media, right, and the press at this point in time. As you might imagine, in today's day and age, in our modern day, TMZ and other newspaper companies, they have no shame. They'll take a horrible photograph of you, put it all over the internet just to have ratings. Back in this day and age, FDR asked the press that was taking photos and doing interviews with him, he specifically asked them, please do not take any photographs or videos while I'm walking or going in between my wheelchairs or whatever, because he wanted that image of strength. And the press understood, and they were very sympathetic towards that. And so it was a wonderful, sort of very respectful relationship that they had, which I wish that the U.S. can get back on track with. And so wonderful FDR from his early years, moving forward to his years later in the Navy on the right-hand side. Definitely a handsome stud, and kind of growing into and becoming molded into that kind of presidential realm. Eventually, as he is running for office, you'll see, various things here, such as, FDR, a big man for a big job, right? President, these wonderful slogans. Or Roosevelt promises national relief, quick action to be put up to Congress. And then now, I love this right here. He's sort of like the captain of the ship because of his days in the Navy. And now a man of courage is at the helm. And so everyone pretty much unanimously agreed that Hoover, for the lack of a better term, sucked. And he did not really, do as much as he needed to in terms of presidential leadership and relief. And so finally everyone said, oh, well, finally we have a president that is actually going to be a man of action. And this is the voting spectrum. Obviously, he completely won in most states. It was pretty much a landslide victory. And so Hoover was not liked, and, folks were definitely voting for FDR during this day and age. So you could just tell that in 1932, most of the United States was saying, please, for the love of God, Roosevelt, come in and help us fix things. And the political cartoons started. Let me get my pointer. Here on the left-hand side, here's, Hoover struggling with all of these various, things, right? Balancing the budget, debt settlements, farm relief, prohibition case, all of these important issues that he's just struggling with, right? The man is erratic with his hair and he doesn't know what to do. And then FDR here just very gently in a stroll just says, just leave him, Herb. I'll do it all after March 4th, right? When he's going to be inside of the presidency. Or even here, on the right-hand side, Hoover over here is, you see H, right? Herbert Hoover on his bag. And, he's just kind of walking away just because he's kind of, defeated, doesn't know what to do. But FDR here is seen as a very lively, energetic figure, right? Throwing out the garbage of Herbert Hoover, right? His prosperity is around the corner slogans, his GOP policies, his entire rugged individualism that we talked about before, right? So he's just tossing it out, right? Because it's time for a new era, time for a new president and a new policy. And so as Roosevelt enters into, office, he understands that he is taking on an incredible responsibility, not just in terms of trying to fix the Great Depression, but also in terms of, he does not know, let's say, everything. And it takes a very astute person to look upon themselves and figure out what you know and what you do not know, what you need advice on. And so he starts to hire a group of intellectuals and social workers, specifically social workers, because we're in a recession, we're in a depression. And so social workers would know a little bit better of how to help people and alleviate some of their needs. So he hires, for instance, Francis Perkins, heading the emergency relief programs, Harold Ikes, veteran of Theodore Roosevelt's campaign. Louis Brandeis advised Wilson on many matters. And so he hired sort of what he saw the best of the best, nicknamed this group collectively as the Brain Trust, a close group of individuals that he sought counsel from. And so very similar to today, how the U.S. president has their various kind of teams, right? FDR was kind of creating his, power team of the Brain Trust to help him on all matters. And so, they were having some various debates, obviously back and forth, what the best thing would be for the country, what the best regulations would be. Should they keep corporations? Should they break them up? Should large firms be more managed by the government with more regulation? Should they take a more medium approach? They're debating back and forth, right? How much the government should be involved in all of this. And so economists were arguing that it was inevitable for large firms to emerge in a successful nation and its economy. And so there was this understanding that eventually these large corporations and firms would continue to grow, but also a discussion that the U.S. government needed to grow as well. And so one of the first things that FDR needed to accomplish was the banks, right? The banking crisis, the money. And so he famously said in 1933, this nation asks for action and action now. And so the bank industry was on the verge of collapse. During this day and age, there were thousands and thousands of local banks. That is how the money system, the banking industry was. Let's say in whatever area you're living in currently, right? There will probably be a few different, small banks, right? All setting up shop, and you can do business with them. Now, in the modern day and era, there's 4, 5, 6 main banks, and that's it, right? We got Wells Fargo, Chase, we have Bank of America, right? A few other big ones, but it's pretty much just consolidated into a few hands now. But in this day and age, we have thousands of smaller ones. But the thing is, the smaller you are, the more risk there is, because you don't have this entire enormous financial backing. And so as soon as the stock market started to lose value, a lot of people started to panic. And so they went to the banks and started to withdraw all of their money. And so if enough people do that, that means that the bank is going to end up closing. And the reason they ended up closing was for this reason, because this is a typical thing that banks do. Whenever you are depositing your money, because how do banks make a lot of income and money on the side? Yes, it's from interest payments or whatever else you need to do, but generally, let's say if you're putting in $100,000 into the bank, they'll understand that at any given moment you'll probably need a few thousand here and there, but you're never going to just go in and take the 100,000 clean out. And so what the bank ends up doing is, as soon as they're getting all of this liquid cash, they end up reinvesting it in various areas, right, to make more profits, right? And so as soon as people started to come in and demand all of their savings to be withdrawn, the banks started to shut down and close, because all of their excess reserve money was just wasted away, and they had to give it back. And so banks started to shut down left and right, and people started to panic even more. And this was the day and age when we did not have banking protections. And so imagine yourself, if you and your family were working your butts off, and let's say you had $50,000 in the bank, right? And your neighbors come up to you and they're running up and just frantically sweating and just saying oh my God, the banks are closing. We have to get our money. I managed to get, a third of my money, and the bank closed. You run over to the bank and they say, the bank is just closed. They're like, sorry, we're out of business. All of your $50,000 is gone. There's no insurance. There's no guarantee. You lost all of your savings. And so people were absolutely terrified and devastated and angry, right, at these kind of situations. And so FDR came in to try to alleviate some of the tensions. And as soon as he went into office, he called for the bank holiday. And so he called for a halt of all banking operations and calling for a special session of Congress to pass a series of emergency laws. So he got to work straight away as soon as he entered into office. And so immediately they passed the Emergency Banking Act. which is the first deal measure that provided for reopening of banks under very strict conditions and was taking the United States off of the gold standard. The reason that we were taking ourselves off the gold standard is because it adds that extra level of flexibility with currency, right? The U.S. government can shift funds around. They passed the Glass-Steagall Act, barring commercial banks from becoming involved in buying and selling of stocks, which is one of the main ways that they were investing all that additional money, right? And so that's why the banks and the stock markets were kind of intermingled during this time. So the fact that the stock market crashed, it was a big hit to the banks as well. And so it also was leading to many irresponsible practices. And so it was an attempt to bar all of the greedy sort of bankers and Wall Street stock market goers from kind of, having these terrible business decisions and investments. And perhaps the thing that lasted throughout the decades up until the modern day is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which the government insures a certain amount of money for every individual depositor. So right now, right, let's say, for the sake of argument, I don't know what bank you what bank you put your money and save in. Let's say it's Chase. Chase will guarantee your money up to a certain point. I think currently it's sitting at 150 or maybe 200 something $1,000. But it's essentially insured, right? So the government will pay off your money if, let's say, God forbid, the bank just goes under. And so people can feel a bit more stable, right? Knowing that they have some type of insurance. Now, let's get into the 100 days and the NRA. And I'm not talking about that NRA, right? This is the non-rifle edition NRA, not the modern gun-ho Second Amendment NRA. So immediately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted, or not really instituted, but he was so charismatic and so chock full of energy during the first 100 days of his presidency, essentially just over the first 3 months, and passing an unprecedented amount of laws that for every single president that came after FDR, their first 100 days would be used as a kind of a testing ring, right? A kind of litmus test of their, let's say, leadership prowess, right? And kind of sets the tone for their entire presidency. And so it helped FDR that, like I said, Congress was mostly Democrats at this point, and they were, in the one and the same mind. So they were passing legislation like never before to try to help the Americans, right? They were suffering. They passed the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was creating, and this is very important, creating public works jobs through federal relief programs. So essentially, they are starting to try to create jobs in the public sector and have people move into those jobs. So, they get a twofer. They have people working and making income, which gets them out of poverty and out of the depression, and the government gets a wonderful product from it because you're actually having, let's say, buildings and bridges and whatever else being built. But the way that they structured initially in 2 short years was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So we're also going to see that FDR, as he's trying to pass all of these wonderful legislations to kind of get the economy up and roaring again, the Supreme Court here and there is going to be looking at some of the bills and saying, that's unconstitutional, we have to shut this down. That is unconstitutional, we have to shut that down. So it's going to be a gentle kind of dance between the two. They also started to employ the NRA, the National Recovery Act, which will be the kind of successor to this. And so they also wanted to make fair codes of fair competition, fair labor practices, and including a national minimum wage. And so this stemmed from FDR's belief that liberty is based on the fair distribution of wealth, allowing market competition to operate, but upon fairness, right? Not out of fairness. All of these political cartoons coming out of this day and age are absolutely glorious. FDR sitting on the left-hand side here. I'll get my pointer. Sweating away, right? Working hard on the budget, on the relief, on the war debts, on jobs, cabinet prohibitives, right? He's just like sweating away. He's working hard. Over here, the congressional action And I don't know what this is supposed to be. Some type of weird hybrid morph between a snail and a horse. I don't know what that hybrid version would be called, but that's supposed to be Congress, because Congress is typically slow, right? That's what they're known for, even today, more so than ever, right? And FDR is kind of on the back with the New Deal program, right? Kind of just like going gun ho, right? Trying to go faster and faster for things to get done. Here's a couple wonderful videos detailing the 100 days of FDR. And so these 100 days, like I said before, became legendary for every other U.S. president that came afterwards to set the tone of their presidency. How much are they going to get accomplished? How much are they truly going to pass for the United States, both domestically and internationally? So great videos to watch. They're only a few minutes long each, so not too terribly long. Definitely worth it. Some other government jobs that FDR ended up passing with Congress. And I know there's a lot here, and I'm just throwing out a lot of different names and organizations at you. Just try to remember the general spectrum of what's going on. And if a couple of these kind of just catches your eye, write those down, and that'll be kind of the main thing that you'll remember for the exams. But he also introduced the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which was a public work relief program, and I loved this. So you have millions of unemployed men in the United States due to the Depression, right? And they're having all of that pent-up energy, right? They were used to working in factories. They were used to working and doing something. And so the CCC was created to provide outdoor manual labor jobs for all these unemployed men, and sent them to rebuild infrastructure, complete conservation programs, send them out into the woods for forest preservation, flood control, national park services. Essentially it's great, right? Sending them out into building projects in the wilderness and just saying, go, right? Start working. The Public Works Administration was also created, dispersing even more funds and construction projects for building of roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, etc. This is a very important point that I want to make. So out of everything we talk about for the New Deal in the slides, this is perhaps the important point that I want people to remember and recognize. And so if you're listening to this, for those of you that are, please write this down for some tips for the final, as far as FDR goes. So this is what the main difference is between him and Hoover. Hoover was absolutely useless when it came to inputting some type of hands-on fix for the economy. FDR was very hands-on to the point where they are rehiring unemployed individuals and getting them back to work. And the third tier of thing that I want to talk about is the discussion to the modern day and age, where in the kind of 2019, 2020 plus COVID situation and the global kind of recession and horrific situation we're finding ourselves in, the United States has deemed it necessary to, let's say, just hand out monthly payments, right, for people. It was 1 or 2 months worth of income payments. That does not really do much, because you essentially give them a 1 month, check, and that's pretty much it. It dries up. Instead, what FDR did here is very reminiscent of what China has been doing for the last number of decades. And they actually looked upon FDR and his policies with the Great Depression, and they instituted it in the last few decades. And so the conversation here is, whenever the economy naturally goes in a recession and a more of an economic slump and you have more unemployed people, the government comes in and hires up these unemployed people and puts them into public works, building roads, bridges, cities, repairing things, whatever you need to do. So the idea here is that all of the work that the government or the local communities or cities or states should be spending on, right, these kind of government projects, you have the people en masse working. So you're getting the best bang for your buck. Yes, you're helping the folks out and getting them out of unemployment and poverty, but at the same time, you're doing a public good and service. So China has been doing that in the last number of decades and has been doing it quite effectively. So I feel that in the current situation, in the modern day and age that we find ourselves in, if the U.S. government is savvy enough, they will restart some of these programs and hire up 5, 10, 15, whatever million people and put them to work. Because God knows our roads need rebuilding, our bridges are in tatters. A number of high-profile, let's say, airports or other high-traffic areas need restructuring as well. So there's a lot of work and good that can be done from all of that. So hopefully we can take a lesson from our own history books and some lessons from foreign countries like China that have taken lessons from us in the past. And so some of these public works, right, such as here, building these large dams, right? Building these large kind of infrastructures. And so truly, right, having a wonderful public good purpose here. And so here we have the Dust Bowl. Oh, the Dust Bowl. So speaking of farming, and speaking of all of the farm closures that we ended up having, so the Dust Bowl was a very famous kind of 1930s situation where all of these additional farms and land that they had ended up getting so dry because millions and millions of acres of land were being farmed too much, right? The nutrients were being sucked out of the soil because folks did not know exactly how to properly till the land. So they were just farming it over and over again, and the nutrients get kind of depleted from the soil, and so the top level of the soil just becomes dry and ashy, right, and sandy. And so then, as the winds start picking up, we start to get these massive dust bowls that are kind of catapulting their way through the Great Plains. And even, kind of expanding from there. And so, multiple farms start to get hit as well. And, FDR institutes another, act, right? The Agricultural Adjustment Act, passing, wanting to improve prices on limited market regulations and supplies. Of course, the Supreme Court later said this was unconstitutional as well. But as we can tell, FDR was trying to remedy the situation, as much as they could. Obviously, since the Dust Bowl, we've kind of learned from our mistakes of not over-tilling the land too much. If you've ever driven past any farmland or territory within California or anywhere abroad, they have typically, right, you kind of have to rotate the soil. So let's say if you imagine your farm and your crops being in very circular manner, so it's completely, let's say, circular. If you divide that between 4 quadrants, 4 semicircles, the idea is, let's say you would be consistently farming 3/4 of the land, but 1/4 of the land would just be left alone each season to replenish the nutrients, put the manure in there, have it rain, right, for the soil to become healthy again. And you kind of rotate that spot every single season. So that's how we do it now. Otherwise, if you just till, 100% of the land year after year after year, it's going to start to lose some of its, gumption. And we have, horrific sort of apocalyptic photos such as this, right? These huge dust storms blowing towards the cities, right? And fast paces and waves. Some truly diabolical looking scenes. The Great Dust Bowl definitely was shutting down a number of farms. It forced a number of people to move towards the coastal cities, which made things even worse, right? Because the farming supplies were going down, our food production was kind of going down a bit. People are migrating towards the cities, which are already struck with unemployment and poverty. So the situation was getting exacerbated quite a bit. Here's a wonderful video on the Dust Bowl, uncovering the Dust Bowl by PBS. If you have some time, definitely watch it to really put you into the mindset and perspective of what was truly going on at the Dust Bowl at the time. The housing crisis. Doesn't it always feel that every few years we have a housing crisis in this country? Jeez, it's like we can never get a break. So, we talked about the banking industry going under, and FDR was trying to save that. But what happens when the banking industry is in shambles? Home mortgages, housing loans, financing, foreclosures, all of that gets affected. And so now millions of Americans were living in overcrowded and unhealthy slums, And so the private sector could not handle this huge economic burden, and trying to pull Americans out of their crisis and slump. And so this history would repeat itself in 2008 with our housing bubble crisis, when President Barack Obama needed to issue massive federal aid to the housing industry and the banks. And so FDR passed the Federal Housing Administration, where it was a government agency that would guarantee mortgages, allow lenders to offer longer term, usually 30-year loans, which you have today. Today we have the standard 30-year loan that started here. This would give out thousands of home units, giving long-term mortgages and really trying to help folks out. And so now it finally became cheaper for Americans to buy homes than to rent apartments. Wish we could have this in Los Angeles. Because now if you try to buy a house in, let's say, LA, as soon as you start working full-time, like, who can afford $700,000 or whatever homes? It's ridiculous. So hopefully the pricing can go down, right, over time. So for any of you statistic fans out there, we have, right, some wonderful graphs and charts for you. So here we can see during the major wars and the Great Depressions, right, housing prices and values, right, were hitting a slump. So here in World War I, housing prices took a huge dive, tried to stabilize a little bit, right? And then during the Great Depression, they ended up rising quite a bit because of all of the programs that FDR started to institute, right? So people were actually buying up houses as much as possible. Right as we were entering World War II, started to plummet again, but especially World War II years, as production is going to start to increase, as factories and money starts to increase in the U.S., and industrial output is going to start to rise. But the biggest thing is, we have a couple various recessions and a couple slumps, right? So the housing market gets hit, right? It always goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But here, during the 2008 housing crisis boom, just look at this catastrophic growth in, pricing. In 2008, that was not sustainable whatsoever. So obviously, it's going to crash, and it is going to crash hard. And so, yeah, definitely lessons to be learned there. And so, like we were saying before, as FDR is passing all of these laws, the Supreme Court is on his heels, always looking at his various acts and saying what is constitutional, what's not constitutional. And so they began to dismantle a lot of his programs and initiatives, citing that he, as the executive power in the United States, is overreaching, and all of these are unconstitutional, right? And so he starts to invalidate. In 1935, they are invalidating the NRA program, the AAA, and saying that it is just too much power that the president has over economic activity. And so the U.S. Supreme Court begins to dismantle the New Deal and tries to put a slowdown to the progress being made. And so eventually we have a wonderful political cartoons such as this, right? FDR here, seeing his beloved NRA and AAA, right, kind of buried, and him just, playing a sweet song, right, as a remembrance. Or here, the legislative and executive branch working wonderfully collectively together, right, to improve the country, and the judicial branch is just sitting there, or standing there, just saying, no, I don't want to be part of this, right, kind of entourage here. And so many were feeling that the Supreme Court was being a little too snooty at the time. But they were just doing their jobs, of course, right? Because you cannot have all of this precedent-setting, acts and materials, right? They have to do their job. And so we also see that during this day and age, we have unions rise again. Unions are one of the most important and foundational safety nets for working people. And it is a shame that over the last number of decades, even leading up to today's current day, the number of unions have been absolutely gutted from the American systems. Right after World War II, into like around the 50s or 60s, 1 out of every 3 or 4 people had a union job. Now it's probably like 1 out of every 10 to 20 people might have a union job, right? The tables have completely turned. So that gives a lot more power to the employer, a lot more power to the corporations, and a lot less leveraging and, let's say, financial stability towards the individual workers. But the federal government during FDR's day and age was trying to be on the same side as labor unions. They were trying to help them grow. Unity amongst the workers started to grow strong for a number of reasons. Most were now American-born. Organizers no longer had to distribute materials in numerous languages because everyone that was born during this day and age could at least speak some type of English. So commonality, right? You can muster the troops together. Many were surviving the sort of like 1920s like downturns, right? And having a common identity. FDR himself, in his inauguration, was kind of describing the terrible and inhumane working conditions in various fields, right, of work. And, as he was reading all of his letters, along with his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she kept telling him consistently throughout his presidency, do not forget about the American people. Do not forget about the workers. And so she always kept reminding him, right, to think of the common people, right, fight for their issues. And so he actually, during this time, we had an individual, Huey Long. He was a senator. And he wanted to start the Share Our Wealth movement, which was an alternative to the New Deal. It proposed confiscating large personal fortunes, so no billionaires, paying off every American family a cash grant of $5,000 a year, and every worker an annual income of $2,500 a year. So essentially, you would just get free money, right, every month and every year. And so this is very similar to whatever Andrew Yang was proposing in the 2020 presidential election with universal income. It would not be the first time. So here we have the Share Our Wealth movement. Later on, Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s would propose some type of universal basic income as well. And we had the 2020 election. So it's been proposed here and there over time. And historically, in 2020, the U.S. government, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, actually gave out money towards the American people as well. So definitely history has been made. And so here we have Mr. Huey Long giving his various speeches, right, trying to, this is, in early and later years of his career, but definitely all these different theories being peddled around, right? What is the best way to get the U.S. economy and the market back into shape? And so now we are coming into the second New Deal. So all of this was part one, folks. And I know it seems like a lot, but there's a lot to be done in the day and age. So let's rise to the challenge. So we just closed off the first New Deal. So if you had to put that into a bullet point, the first New Deal and all of that legislation that FDR passed, it was focused on economic recovery. Fix the economy right now to make people's lives easier, right? Economic recovery. The second New Deal is going to focus on future economic stability, making sure that in the future this is not going to happen again, or at least trying to prevent it as much as possible. And so the WPA that we have over here, the Works Progress Administration that was created, was starting to provide even more jobs for millions of unemployed people going into those construction jobs like we were talking before. Constructing thousands of public buildings, bridges, and more than 500,000 miles of roads and 600 airports. Massive undertaking. Artists even. So you could think to yourself, okay, fine. Well, if you hire everyone and just give them construction work jobs, what about the humanities? What about the artists? All of the museums and buildings and airports that they were building, they needed beautiful art. So they hired the artists to make these grandiose murals, right? And giving live musicians and performers a platform to demonstrate their art as well. So all of this was intertwined, right? Giving all of these people a chance to work. We had the Wagner Act, establishing that unionization needed to be, obviously represented more, empowering workers to have more representation in unions, and outlawing firing or blacklisting union organizers. So if you randomly stood up in your workplace and said, "Hey guys, we need to unionize because these, the managers are oppressing us," typically they would just fire you as the head honcho and the leader of the gang, and that's it, right? They would just threaten everyone. And so now they made that illegal if you, said that you want to start unionizing. One of the most long-held and safest acts that they passed, which was the Social Security Act. Probably you know of at least one person that has Social Security, right? Any of your grandparents or parents or wherever, right? Starting in 1935 and still alive today, this was a retirement pension, right? And giving unemployment insurance and disability insurance and public assistance / welfare. So essentially, at this point in time, FDR and Americans realized that when there is truly a global recession or depression, the folks at the lower end of the socio-economic ladder are getting hit the hardest. And typically those are the sick, the elderly, and the unemployed, right? If you had to kind of just make a general summation. And so this was an attempt to really help folks out as much as possible and give them what it is called a social safety net. Society is creating this man-made social safety net so that no matter how far from your previous job and you're unemployed and you lose your house and this, at least you could say, oh, well, I'll go on unemployment insurance for a little bit, right? To get back onto my feet, right? You are not just going to be utterly, completely, hopefully, destitute and be on the streets. Here we have FDR hitting back against the Supreme Court, trying to change judicial power. So this was seen kind of on both sides of the aisle as FDR having a failed experiment and perhaps overreaching his powers a bit. So as the Supreme Court and their conservative members were voting against his measures, he ended up concocting what was called the court packing plan. Nothing super official, but the newspapers really just spun it around and turned public opinion on this particular issue against him. And so FDR in 1937 attempted to formally increase the number of U.S. Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15. The reason he wanted to do this is because he wanted the additional 6 members to be his people that would vote alongside with him. Essentially, he would own the Supreme Court and they would vote on whatever it is that they needed to vote on. And so surprisingly, the court themselves began to side with FDR on a lot of his new initiatives to save the economy. I'm guessing because they started to see that his economic policies were actually working, and that people were truly devastated by the Depression. The court turned aside challenges to Social Security, right, and the Wagner Act and all those other ones, and affirmed that the federal power did have the necessary constitutional legality to regulate wages, hours, child labor, agricultural production, and other aspects of life that the government should provide, right, or at least make sure that are running smoothly. However, both the right and the left of this country started to look at FDR when he wanted to do his court packing plan and said, dear God, man, this is completely un-American, right? This is not a bipartisan issue. This is an American issue. You should not be messing with the Constitution of the United States in terms of the number of Supreme Court justices. That's not something you should be doing. And so this video on the right-hand side kind of details some of that thought here, right? And some of the kind of mishaps between the different branches of government. And so here's a great political cartoon where FDR is on the right-hand side, kind of smiling and grinning. And then his packed court of Supreme Court nominees, they look like puppets, right? So they have those little jaws and they look like puppets just saying whatever he wants them to say, which is, yes, yes, we all vote yes. And Uncle Sam is there on the left-hand side just being shocked, like, what? The Supreme Court is agreeing with him? And so all these political cartoons were trying to make fun of the fact that FDR is trying to gain too much power here. Very similar here. I'll get my pointer. Uncle Sam, and for those of you who have ever read the Odyssey or the Iliad, can kind of remember the whole like Trojan horse, Trojan war gambit. And so we have the Supreme Court here, right? The packing case moving towards Uncle Sam. And so the FDR is kind of trying to just sneak them in, right? Or over here on the right-hand side, FDR once again being that Navy guy that he was. The compass doesn't point the way I want to go. Change it now. And the compass is the Supreme Court. And so Congress is one of the sailors, right? His hat kind of blowing off of him because he's absolutely shocked that FDR would propose changes to the Supreme Court like this. Good quality political cartoons, folks. Ooh, Keynesian economics. So in 1936, John Keynes publishes The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. So for any of you who are possible economics majors, this might be interesting for you. He started writing that he was believing in large-scale spending and that it was necessary to sustain purchasing power and stimulate economic activity during downturns. Essentially, that the federal government had the responsibility and mandate to increase its spending over time in order to make sure that the economy is chugging along swimmingly. And so it was known as Keynesian economics, and FDR started to follow it in 38 and beyond. And so the government's main goal now would be public spending is okay if it is to revive the economy, right? And so this entire notion of this goes completely against what Hoover was going for, right? Because Hoover was very conservative, saying that the economy will fix itself, and that, in essence means the government's not spending any money to fix the issue. FDR's plan under Keynesian economics is that it is okay to spend exorbitant amounts of money by the federal government if it means that we are reinvesting it back into, right, the economy and making life better. In the New Deal and the new government they were forming, female agency gets a large bump as well. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor and advised FDR directly on public policy. Mary Dewson was a leader in women's educational and industrial unions, began to rally women voters behind FDR and first presidency as well. As the Depression hit and the industrial sector was harder hit than others, women's proportion in the workforce naturally started to increase, right? Because they needed to start working to provide for their families as well. And so World War I was a great opportunity for women to get back into the workforce and really push gender boundaries. The Depression is another way, right? They started to come in and work and push boundaries. World War II is going to be another one. So it really seems that during times of crises, it was actually some of the most beneficial times for women and female agency during the 20th century, really pushing the sort of gendered, the gendered, gap, right, that they were having in the workforce, in society and life, and kind of changing the public perception of what should be. Eleanor Roosevelt, right, the famous wife of FDR, was with him throughout all of his terms, and she was the longest serving first lady of the U.S. because Roosevelt had 4 terms in office, twice the number of terms that any other president had been. And so she was a distant cousin to FDR, for any of you Game of Thrones fans out there, through Theodore Roosevelt's side of the family. And so they famously met at a shindig, at a get-together, and it was history from there. And so Eleanor Roosevelt had a wonderful history because she was always a champion of the people. They both came from privileged families, but Eleanor had for some reason, this heart of gold. She loved community service. She loved giving back to the people. And throughout the presidency of FDR, she was consistently a voice within the Oval Office, telling him, never forget about the people. What are you doing about the people? we need to fix this situation because they are hurting. And so she was definitely as much of an influence within the sort of New Deal era as FDR was, right? She was absolutely instrumental. African American stigmas. So, because of this New Deal situation we were having, and Social Security and unemployment insurance and welfare, one thing stuck within the African American community, as we were talking about, like Jim Crow laws and discrimination, segregation, all of this. The welfare stigma started to stick to the African American community, unfortunately. And so the famous quote and stigma was that African Americans were the last hired and first fired. And so the Social Security was supposed to help everyone in public need. And any individual that needed assistance, right, should unabashedly and unashamed go and receive assistance so that they can get up on their feet. But this era started to kind of feel this welfare stigma for people receiving government assistance, right? And so unemployment numbers were, skyrocketing. But the African American community unemployment numbers were double that of whites, and disproportionately benefiting from the government relief programs, or disproportionately applying for them. And so this is not a surprise, just because we're still in the 30s here, and so the African American community is still reeling back from Reconstruction. Trying to integrate as much as possible, even though there's legalized segregation in the country. Trying to go to school, trying to get into the workforce and uplift the communities. There's housing discrimination, not giving them enough homes, giving them rental communities instead. All of these types of issues, and so of course, right, the depression is going to be hitting them very hard as well, and so they're going to need assistance. Anybody in that situation would, and so. It starts the very long road throughout the decades, even into today's day and age, where some critics of the African American community, or critics of the left and the Democrats, let's say on the more conservative side, will say, "Oh well, they're just on welfare, right? They're sitting on welfare all day." That's where the stigma is born from, right? During the Depression era, and unfortunately has been continued and bastardized into the modern day and age. The Native Americans were not to be forgotten. FDR wanted to implement the Indian New Deal, reforming Native Americans to have better access to these relief programs, and improving lives as well. But unfortunately, there was also this subsidiary goal of policies of assimilation and eradicating tribal heritage through white schooling and indoctrination into the culture, right? And so, on one hand, it was the government trying to obviously support them and give relief and education and money. On the other hand, they were also kind of peddling very similar mantras of please incorporate yourself into the larger American white spectrum, right, and white culture. Now, the end of the lecture. So let me wrap it up with a few points. The Great Depression began due to failed policies, due to money run amok in the stock markets and the banking industries. This same situation would happen again in our lifetimes during the 2008-2009 crisis. So history does repeat itself sometimes. And it required the New Deal. Part 1, which was immediate economic relief. Part 2, which was to ensure that this would not happen again by instituting all of these departments and Social Security Act and all these other various things to make sure that future generations don't have to go through this. But one big lesson to learn from the New Deal is that, in strict contrast to Hoover's inability and not wanting to actually do anything to fix, the economic horrors, FDR implemented Keynesian economics to say it is okay to pump government federal money into the economy because it is for the betterment and growth of the economy, right? So that is the kind of lesson to be learned here. And after this point in time, whenever the U.S. was in need of, let's say, really fixing or restructuring something, FDR's terms as president are going to be the gold standard, because finally liberals and progressives can tell any like diehard conservatives, look, FDR put in money into the economy and it worked. We know that the policy works. And so it was shown to be this gold standard of how to move forward during a crisis. But that is the end of the Great Depression and the New Deal lecture. Moving forward, we are going to be going into World War II, a very popular section for my classes, because for any of you who are playing Call of Duty games or Battlefield 5 or anything else, or you just love World War II movies like Saving Private Ryan, there's so much material out there and great movies for us to kind of relive a lot of these situations. And so it's going to be a really nice lecture moving forward, but I just want to thank all of you for being here today and viewing this lecture as always. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully you learned a few things, kind of talking about it in between the slides. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.